In this video I'm going to give you my recommended settings for 007 First Light on the Steam machine at 1440p. First off, I need to tell you that this game has FSR 3.1.5 baked into the game, so unfortunately we can't upgrade it to FSR 4.1 the way we can in a lot of other titles. This alone would have given us much better performance, but unfortunately we can't do it. What's in the menu is what we're working with. Given that, I settled on 1440p with FSR set to balanced, and I'd say that's the sweet spot in terms of upscaling on this hardware. Quality mode doesn't leave you enough headroom for the busier levels, and performance starts showing its age with this version of FSR, especially on moving crowds or fast-paced scenes like a car chase. Balanced holds together well in motion, and it gives the GPU enough headroom to breathe. You can see the settings I've chosen on the right side of the screen, and I want to go over the major settings and why I chose them. And surprisingly, this is a game that does not scale well both in terms of performance and visual fidelity, and what this means is that even on the lowest settings the game looks pretty decent, and going above medium on the Steam machine will result in far more performance loss than visual gain. What you can expect from the settings I settled upon is around 50 FPS in the very busy sections, and most of the time comfortably above 60, often well above it. That's holding up even in levels with a ton of action and a lot of NPCs on screen, which is where I expected the game to kind of fall apart, but I think it holds pretty well. You can absolutely get a lot more than 60 FPS, but you kind of have to drop down the resolution and some other settings. I think this is a good balance and a good compromise, and yeah, we're not gonna be able to reach 60 all the time, but I think for the most part it's gonna be pretty good. Now the first major setting is texture quality, and I've settled at medium. On the Steam machine we're working with 8 gigs of VRAM, and that's the reason that I've chosen to set this to medium. This is the one setting that people really get wrong on the Steam machine, because higher textures don't cost you frame rate directly, they cost you VRAM. And when you run out of the VRAM, the game starts leaning on system memory instead, and that messes with the whole system, and it doesn't show up as a lower average, it shows up as hitching, which is far more annoying. At medium texture quality we can handle that without issues, we still have some VRAM left, and you can see the difference between low, medium and high, especially in terms of VRAM usage, and I think medium is a pretty good spot, both in terms of performance and in terms of visual fidelity. Next up in the settings menu we have texture filtering, which on the other hand is essentially free. It doesn't really affect performance that much, but it does a lot for how rough surfaces and edges look, so that's at 16 times, and there's no reason to run this at any lower. Now the next one I have examples is terrain quality, and this is the one place I went the other way and I put it at high. It affects the virtual textures on terrain surfaces, and it barely affects the frame rate. Since we've already saved a good chunk of VRAM memory on textures, this is a sensible place to spend some of it back, and the step up from the lower options is clearly visible on the ground. You may not be looking at the ground at all times, but I think you will appreciate a little bit more detail. Next up, shadow quality. I've set that to medium. Low is where you actually start losing shadows, like on a lot of NPCs, it's just straight up going to remove the shadows, and the actual shadow resolution is going to be pretty bad. You can see a comparison here between the 4 different versions. It cuts down on the self-shadowing on Bond himself, which really kind of hurts sometimes in the stealth sections of this game. You can really notice it in the levels. At the other end, Ultra reduces some of the shadow flickering that we can see in this game, but it doesn't fully clean it up, and it costs a lot of performance and VRAM at every step throughout. So between medium, high and ultra, I think medium is a sensible choice here. Volumetric quality is also at medium. For this one, the developers actually built a new volumetric system that handles the fog, the light shafts, the fire and the smoke, and it's kind of hard to notice the difference between low, medium, high and ultra. So it might be tempting to just put it to ultra, but the moment you're in a firefight where a car explodes and there's a lot of smoke and fire, the higher option gets really expensive performance-wise really fast. And it's that exact moment that you don't really want FPS drops. You will see it regardless, but I think if you keep it at medium, it's gonna keep the good moments smooth while still looking pretty good. Global illumination is a setting that usually affects performance a lot. It really depends on how it's implemented and how many light sources there are in the game. And I think it's doing a lot for how the game looks, probably more than any other setting. Between low and medium, there isn't that big a difference, but between medium and high, it's a huge difference in how the game looks. However, at high, it really starts to choke, especially on the Steam machine. So medium is my choice here. I wish I could go to high. It does give you slightly more accurate light bounce and better ambient shadowing at high, especially indoors. But at 1440p on the Steam machine, I would rather keep a little bit headroom for those crowded scenes, for those scenes where something explodes, something happens on the screen. So I would have to keep this one at medium. Next up, reflections. I've left this at high, and this setting mainly affects the planar reflections, which are the mirrors in this game. If you look at surface level scattering reflections between the four settings, there isn't that big of a difference. But if you look at a mirror directly, you're gonna see a ton of difference. At the lowest setting, you can't even see a reflection. It is getting pretty expensive performance-wise to have these reflections on, especially when you're looking at a mirror. But there are very few moments where you are actually looking at a mirror. It's very situational. You only pay for it when you're standing directly in front of a mirror or a mirrored surface. But the actual reflections, they do add a lot to this game, even on the floor or on windows. So I'd left this at high, and for 90% of the game, it's not really going to affect performance. These are the settings that you can change in-game. The other in-game settings are purely for how you want the game to look aesthetics-wise, so vignetting, motion blur, film grain, stuff like that. I've toggled some of these on or off. They don't really affect performance. They're more of a choice of how exactly you want it to look. I have two extra toggles on the SteamOS itself. You can get to them using the 3-dot button on your Steam controller, and then you can open the side menu and go to the performance tab, and one of them is allow tearing enabled. This lets frames present without waiting on the actual display. So instead of a stutter when you miss your target of an FPS, you'll get a tear on the screen. And on a VRR display, it also helps the frame pacing feel more even. So I would rather have that than the alternative. The other one is half rate shading. This is a setting that I avoided at all times on the Steam Deck because it just does not work great on smaller resolution. When you enable this setting, you usually lose clarity on small things, especially like text. But at 1440p, it doesn't mess with the image that much, so I thought it's worth experimenting with it. How it works is, normally the GPU runs the pixel shader once for every pixel on the screen. Half rate shading tells it to run that shader once every 2 pixels instead and reuse the results, so you're doing half the pixel shading work. The trait is that fine detail, thin edges and text can get slightly softer. In theory, it should be free performance. In practice, especially in this game that I'm testing it, I don't think it's doing a whole lot for the frame rate, and that's usually a sign that the bottleneck is probably somewhere other than pixel shading. So if you don't like what it does to the image, you're really not losing much by turning it off, but I'll keep experimenting with this setting in the future and see if it can gain us some performance. Overall, I think this config is great for 1440p on the Steam machine. The one thing I would leave you with is that if you're not hitting your target, don't sit in the menu dropping every setting to low, because this game won't reward you for it. I think if you really need to increase the FPS, you should first change the resolution or the FSR preset and then see where you go from there. That's gonna be it for this one. If you guys enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like. If you hated it, leave a dislike and let me know what I can do to improve. And if you're into Steam, Steam Deck, Steam hardware and gaming handhelds, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.